autism risk or autism symptom expression in the form of we know that mothers with maternal diabetes are at increased risk for having a child with autism. We know that older age of mothers, along with older age of parents and all sorts of other factors. We know that mothers on the protective end, we know that mothers who take folic acid reduce the risk of having a child with autism. So these are all empirically correct statements. But because of the sensitive nature of this, it's very important for me to state unambiguously what our relatively modest goals are in the context of this work. So we are interested here in examining the association, the relationship between child symptomatology, between a child's symptoms, and the parent's behavior in the context of those symptoms. Ultimately, what we're interested in doing, and what we've already begun doing, as you'll hear, is utilizing this relationship in order to support children with autism and their families. Okay, so the first project I'm going to talk about is one on family accommodation in autism. So the idea for this project was actually born back in 2013 over a cup of coffee at the Yale Child Study Center with Professor Ellie Leibowitz, who is now the Assistant Director of the Anxiety Disorders Program at the Child Study Center. Implementing the study was only possible in collaboration with Professor Ditsa Zachor, who runs the Autism Center at Asaf HaRofeh Medical Center in Israel, which is one of the largest providers of diagnostic services for autism in the country. And the data for this study was collected and organized, and really the study actually took place because of wonderful graduate students, one of whom was sitting here with us today, Yael, and other graduate students, and Val Feldman, who's already graduated, and Shani Wismail, who's sort of taking the torch from Yael. I'm mentioning all these names now because if you hear anything that you don't like, or if you have any criticism, I'm happy to share that with my collaborators and my students, and not keep that all for myself.
מי הטלפון הזה?
שלי, שאלתי אותו פה, אנחנו מחפשים אותו.
Okay, so family accommodation is somewhat of a known entity in the context of OCD, in the context of obsessive compulsive disorder. More than 20 years worth of research in that area has taught us about this concept of family accommodation, which refers to the ways in which an individual modifies their behavior in order to alleviate the symptoms of a family member which are associated with or related to a mental disorder. The research in this area has painted us a fairly clear picture of the role of family accommodation in the context of OCD and anxiety disorders. We know that elevated levels of family accommodation are associated with increased symptom severity, increased OCD symptom severity, with lower psychosocial functioning, with more parent distress, and poorer response of the child to intervention. The knowledge that we've accrued in that area has been sufficient to develop a specific intervention targeting family accommodation. And just about a month ago, Ellie Leibowitz and his colleagues published a randomized controlled study comparing the use of cognitive behavioral therapy to this specific focused parent-based intervention working only on family accommodation. I'm just going to turn this around so you guys can see. I may as well take this out. The findings, which are obviously outside the context of today's talk, are really striking. So you see here the improvement, or you don't see, the improvement between pre and post the intervention using CBT, which is sort of the standard intervention for OCD and anxiety disorders, and using their parent-based intervention. And the families ended up in even slightly a better situation who had received their intervention, which is called SPACE. So again, I'm not going to talk about that more today, but anybody who's interested, I'm happy to send you the actual paper, which is again sort of fresh out of the press. Over this cup of coffee in New Haven back in 2013, Ellie and I were talking about our interests and our work, with our clinical interests and our research interests, and we came to discuss the partial phenotypic overlap that we know exists between obsessive compulsive disorder and autism. That similarity that exists is not evident only in the behaviors in which we see in the children with these disorders. It's evident even in the diagnostic criteria themselves. So if we open up the DSM, right, our Bible of Psychiatry, and we look at the criteria, the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder, we see delineated in criterion B restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. If we then turn to obsessive compulsive disorder, we see that compulsions are defined as repetitive behaviors or mental acts. So these are not synonymous. They're not the same, but they certainly bear a strong resemblance to each other. Beyond the phenotypic overlap, it's possible that we're actually talking about two disorders here with a common etiology, with a shared heredity. We know that there are very high rates of comorbidity that exist between OCD and autism. We know that children of parents with obsessive compulsive disorder are at increased risk themselves for a diagnosis of autism, and conversely, relatives of an individual with autism are at increased risk for being diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder. Given all that, Ellie and I posed what seemed at the time to be an obvious question. Does family accommodation exist in autism? In other words, do parents of children with autism accommodate their children's symptoms in an effort to alleviate the distress caused by those symptoms? And if such accommodation exists, with what might it be associated?
Can you give an example or two of what kind of behaviors parents do to accommodate?
Yes. So if you think about a child with OCD whose compulsive behavior is hand washing, right? So parents would make sure that if maybe it's a short child that can't reach the sink, parents would make sure that there's always a stool next to the sink so that the child, when they feel the compulsion, they can go up to the sink. So it's proactive. It's proactive in OCD. I'll give you real life examples from autism later on, but it's proactive accommodation of the compulsion. It's not sort of turning my back to the child and saying, do what you want. It's proactively encouraging or facilitating it. If the slides weren't pretty, I wouldn't care so much, but the slides are.
Do we get to see the first ones too?
In fast forward? No. I'll show you the important parts. So that's Ellie, that's Ditza. And these
That's the cup of coffee.
and that is the cup of coffee, exactly. Actually, it wasn't that kind of coffee, but it was the best I could do for the image. Okay. The field has taken small steps towards the asking of this question for a while. So there have been a couple of small papers published looking at family accommodation of comorbid anxiety symptoms in children with autism. So one paper in 2015 found that accommodation, again, of comorbid anxiety symptoms in children with autism was first of all very common. So parents of children with autism and anxiety accommodated their children's anxiety symptoms a lot. But the more the parents accommodated those anxiety symptoms, the higher level, the more severe those anxiety symptoms were. And they were able to use cognitive behavioral therapy to reduce family accommodation of those anxiety symptoms, which led to a reduction in the symptomatology. An intervention study found that higher levels of family accommodation of OCD symptoms in children with comorbid OCD and autism predicted poorer response on the part of the child to cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm happy to send the slides to whoever wants afterwards. Okay, so in order to begin asking this question that we felt was worthy of being asked, the first step was to take the existing family accommodation measure from the OCD and anxiety literature and modify it so that it would be appropriate for our context. And so we created what we call the Family Accommodation Scale for Restricted and Repetitive Behaviors, or the FAS-RRBs. We couldn't come up with a catchy acronym, and I'm sorry. We took this questionnaire and we ran it by a group of parents of children with autism to make sure that it made sense to them, that it had face validity. And then we took it and we paired it with the RBSR, the Repetitive Behavior Scale Revised, which is sort of a tried and true measure. That's a parent report measure containing 43 items, which divides repetitive behavior into 6 groups: stereotypic, self-injurious, compulsive, ritualistic, sameness, and restricted. So the family accommodation measure and this measure of restricted and repetitive behaviors were taken, and they were included in what was already happening at Asaf Harofeh's Autism Center. So they were just added to the existing gold standard diagnostic evaluation that was taking place at Asaf Harofeh. So what is the FAS-RRB? This is the FAS-RRB. So it's 11 items in its entirety, so it's super short. The first 7 items measure what we actually call accommodation. So we asked parents, with what degree of frequency do you provide items to your child that are associated with their RRBs? With what frequency do you participate in your child's behaviors? Do you help them avoid stimuli associated with their RRBs? Have you proactively helped your child avoid doing things, going places, being with others because of their RRBs? Have you modified your family routine, your work schedule, your leisure activities in order to accommodate, in order to sort of structure your whole family life around your child's symptoms? The final 4 items of the measure look not at accommodation itself, but at the impact or reaction to accommodation or lack of accommodation. So does engaging or not engaging in accommodation cause you or your child distress? How does your child respond when you don't engage in accommodation? Do they become angry, abusive? Do they spend more time engaging in their RRBs? We collected data on 125 children who came to the Autism Center at Asaf Harofeh for an initial diagnosis of autism. So the public nature of this clinic is very evident here because it's a very heterogeneous sample. What you see is that most of the kids that data was collected on are between the ages of 3 and 9 with a mean of 6. About a quarter of them are female. Specifically, when you look at the mean verbal IQ score, you see that this is really a group of children with a range of capacities. This heterogeneity is highlighted even more when we look at their adaptive behavior, their adaptive functioning, as measured by the Vineland. And so it's very important to keep in mind that this is quite a heterogeneous group of children who are at their initial diagnosis of autism, and we need to contextualize our findings accordingly.
That means some of them were not diagnosed eventually?
No, these all got a confirmed diagnosis of autism. Okay. But it means that we're talking here about sort of a natural state of interaction, because these are not parents who knew that their children had autism before this point.
And between the age of 6 and 9?
Between the ages of 3 and 9, mean of 6.
Very old.
We basically give this to whoever came.
Okay.
So these were the 125 families who came.
Did any of the kids already have treatment for some other diagnosis that previously received?
There were some kids who came in with other diagnoses. But right. We don't know about intervention. It's a good question. It's very possible that it exists in the database, but we haven't looked at that. It's a good question. Okay. So the first question that we had asked was, does this exist? Do parents of children with autism accommodate their children's restricted and repetitive behaviors? And the answer here was a fairly resounding yes. So 95% of parents report that they have accommodated, do accommodate, the questionnaire says in the last month, their children's RRBs. 66% report doing so on a daily basis. More than half report that engaging in this accommodation causes them distress. And nearly 60% report that when they don't accommodate, their child responds aggressively. Particularly frequent forms of accommodation that were noted by parents include participating in RRB-related actions, providing items related to their child's behaviors, and helping their children avoid stimuli that are associated with their RRBs. So to follow up on Ariel's question, so what does this actually mean? If we're saying that parents of children with autism accommodate their children's RRBs, what does that mean is actually happening in the home? So extrapolating from the parents' responses to the questionnaire, if parents tell us that their child cries and screams when someone other than a family member enters the home, so this is a child who's accommodated by parents who enforce a no visitor policy in the home. If you're not part of the family, you cannot come in the door. And in situations where there needs to be a repair or other type of service provision, plans are made to take the child out of the home in order to allow that to happen. If parents say a child gets mad when his bed or room are not arranged in a very specific fashion, so accommodation in that context would be parents who arrive at work consistently late because after bringing their children to school in the morning, they need to come back home before going to work in order to arrange their child's room just so. A girl who must organize the dishes and set the table on her own in a specific way every night is accommodated by parents who first allow that to happen. And second of all, say that we as a family are not going to sit down and eat dinner until our daughter is both able and willing to actually engage in setting the table in the way in which she prefers. Final example involves parents who said that their son must have a cookie in his hand every time he leaves the home, a specific type of cookie. And so accommodation in this context is parents who make sure to always have that specific type of cookie in the house and to place a cookie jar next to the door so that the child can reach it and it's accessible, so that every time they leave the home, it's easy for them to access that cookie. I didn't know the cookie jar still existed in 2019, but apparently it's still a thing. Okay, so in response to our first question, does accommodation exist in autism? The answer seems to be, at least in our sample, that it does. So the second part of the question was, if it exists, with what is it associated? And here we're talking about simple correlations. So looking at the response, the connection, the correlation between parents' responses to the family accommodation measure and the measure looking at RRBs, we see a strong, clear, and positive correlation between those measures. Basically telling us that the more or increased levels of family accommodation are associated with increased symptom severity of RRBs. While the relationship between family accommodation and RRB severity is strong and clear and positive, there is also a clear, if somewhat less strong correlation between family accommodation and adaptive functioning as measured by the Vineland, but in the opposite direction. So what you see is that the more families are accommodating, the more likely their child's symptoms are to be more severe, and the more difficulty their children are going to have in terms of their adaptive functioning and daily living skills. So just to sum up, we asked if family accommodation exists in autism, and the answer is, again, based on this sample, yes, and it appears to occur frequently. With what is it associated? It seems to correlate strongly with increased RRB severity and lower adaptive functioning. So it seems like it's something that is worth our attention, and it's worth us trying to understand more. There are several important limitations and complications of this work, and again, this is all preliminary. First, the study was done at a single time point, and so we are making no claims of directionality or causality, simply that there is an association, there's a correlation. As I mentioned, this is a heterogeneous sample, and obviously we need to take a more nuanced look at subgroups. Additionally, all the measures we looked at here are parent reports, so this is a very singular perspective, right? It's only the way parents see things. But I think more centrally than all those limitations is that phenotypic overlap does not imply functional similarity. So we need to ask ourselves, even if this behavior looks the same, or even if on a behavioral level it is the same, what is the function of that behavior? So in OCD, we know that the function of compulsive behavior is to reduce anxiety. And that all of these compulsive behaviors are part of an endless cycle of anxiety and anxiety reduction, and anxiety and anxiety reduction. And that cycle makes it always worth us intervening. The case of autism and restricted and repetitive behaviors is far less unambiguous. We know that there are restricted and repetitive behaviors that are maladaptive, with the most obvious example of being self-injurious behavior. But we also know that there are restricted and repetitive behaviors that are adaptive, that are self-regulatory in nature. And we obviously would not want to eliminate those behaviors if they're serving a purpose for that individual. We can also posit that there are some forms of accommodation that are helpful and other forms of accommodation that are unhelpful. So really the question that we need to be asking and answering here is, what is the nature of the interaction between different forms of accommodation and different types of RRBs, and which of those are adaptive and which of those are maladaptive? Obviously, we need to understand what is mediating the relationship between family accommodation and symptom severity, with the most obvious candidates being gender, age, level of support needed. It's necessary, and we're about to start taking a longitudinal and developmental perspective to understand the long-term effects of family accommodation. We're also adding a qualitative piece to understand what parents actually mean when they tell us that this is happening in the home, so sort of the story behind the accommodation. And we're very much interested on what effect reducing accommodation will have, again, with our eyes sort of focused on an eventual goal of thinking about the possibility of a targeted intervention focused on reducing family accommodation. So that's the end of this part. And so maybe I can stop now and take questions before we move on to the next project. Or I can just stop and drink coffee.
I would think, in addition to age of child, also maybe age of diagnosis would mediate that. Because if the kid's gone for many years with having problems that were incorrectly, partially, or undiagnosed,
there's going to be like cyclical.
then there's, the whole cycle
Mhm.
set in.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I have a question too, but other people have questions as well, so maybe you can go first.
I found the issue of what function it serves very interesting. I'm not in the field, I'm not an expert or anything, but I would say that this kind of behavior, and these are all undiagnosed kids, but parents probably see there's a problem, and maybe there are, in some cases, I don't know, like buying what we call in Hebrew, how do you say it? צחיקת תעשייתי.
Get quiet in the household.
So maybe not because they are concerned with the behavior, but for example, they want to work on the communication skills. But we can do that because of the cookie. So let's give them the cookie so we can go on with that.
Yeah.
So did you, and that would be different from, let's just give them what they want to keep quiet. So did you
So
look
you're
at
asking
that?
basically why parents are engaging.
motivation for the parents.
Yeah.
He's saying that the same way that you're asking about functionality for the kids, are we also asking about functionality for the parents?
Yeah, so
That-
that's
that-
definitely something that we could add to the qualitative piece that will be doing, understanding what their motivation is. But like you said, I think what we know from OCD and what we don't know in autism is that regardless, in OCD at least, it doesn't help, right? Like you said, it's something that reinforces itself very quickly. My child's engaging in something, my child's having a hard time, they're distressed, I'm gonna provide them with a stimulus, with an item, or remove a stimulus or item, and they're gonna feel better right now. That's gonna increase the chance that I'm gonna do the same thing next time. So the question is, what's sort of the algorithm? Is that helpful in the long run, not helpful in the long
Also
run?
depends on how broad the phenotype is. So if you have a very specific problem, I don't know how specific OCD is, but it sounds to me like more specific than autism, then when you're dealing with the behavior by either encouraging it or preventing it, then you are focusing on that specific behavior. But you have a broader set of problems, then you deal with one symptom, then you actually, it affects the other symptoms.
There's definitely more complexity, absolutely.
נורית, אני רק רוצה להמשיך את השאלה, אז סליחה. I really want to kind of pinpoint something.
You heard this though.
I did, and I didn't say it then, but I'm saying it now. I really want to pinpoint what Ariel, I think, is so appropriately getting to, and that is that in addition to the limitations I think that you so appropriately talked about, I do think that RRB is just part of what we're looking at, and I believe two things. One is that autism is a little bit more complicated than just the behavioral component of it, and I'm not sure that this research is capturing that, and that may be a further step and a good thing to think about. But my second point is that correlations are very different than causal things, and even if you're talking about what can predict something else, it's not always causal. I think that what we need to look at is not just the parent's perception of this, but if there's any kind of way of looking actually at the severity of the behavioral manifestation, such that it may be that there's more accommodation when there's more severity, and when there's more severity, in essence, there might be more difficulty with responding to intervention. So it may not be because of the accommodation, but rather because of the severity of the issue. And that hasn't been teased out either. So I think that those two things, but I think that those two things, both the broader phenotype of autism and the broader aspect of severity, may end up giving you a little bit clearer way of focusing in on it. And I do believe that the parent's perception is really important.
No, I'm also the same point. So one thing is when you do the intervention, that would help to see whether accommodation is. But also when you do the accommodation, maybe you should bear in mind that what he's suggesting, the fact that it could be that it's worse for the RRB, but better for other aspects.
social function.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So right, absolutely. Those are things that without a longitudinal perspective we can tease apart the real effects. Absolutely.
actually, yeah. When you wrote there, you're intending to look at helpful and unhelpful accommodation, and really what is it Ariel? What he said, Ariel said as well. It's sort of that. My son, who was diagnosed by Dietz 3 years ago, for example, he gets the specific brand of cookie that he wants, two of them exactly, not more, not less, every day. When he walks in the door, as part of a program to, because we're dealing with things, because we need shikitasiati on that in order to deal with a whole raft of things that we can't get to any other way. So I would tick all your boxes, but I would call it a helpful facilitation, a helpful accommodation, because there's a great plan behind it.
Yeah. These are the complexities. And again, the only statement that I feel comfortable making right now based on this data is that it's something that happens. That's all we know. And we don't know the mechanism, we don't know what impact it has. It just seems to me, based on this, that it's something worth paying attention to and looking at closer. But these are all questions that are,
You've continued to answer that, ask it anyway, you had them on your slide.
Sorry?
You had them on your slide, I'm doing something you want to just.
No, it's still
Hang your
helpful to
hand
your,
on that one.
it's also helpful to your parents' perspective. Okay? Okay, so moving on. So we talked about the relationship at a single time point between a parent's behavior and child symptomatology or symptom expression. What I'm going to talk about now is using parents as mediators of their child's intervention. So this story too harkens back to my days at the Yale Child Study Center. One of my clinical supervisors there was Dr. Karen Bears, who's now at Seattle Children's Hospital, University of Washington. When I was there, Karen was running a large study. She was developing a parent-mediated intervention for young children with autism and disruptive behavior. So this was sort of in the throes of the study, so the manual was still being photocopied and handed out. It was chaotic. There were tons of kids coming in and tons of therapists doing the actual work. I was very excited about the existence of this type of program, and so I said to Karen then, when it's ready, please let me know. And so she did let me know a couple years ago, and as soon as physically possible, I got my hands on the manual. There's a therapist manual and a parent manual, and very soon after that, a young man walked into my office, who was sitting right there without the glasses, and more shaven. But Eyal Cohen walked into my office and introduced himself actually for the first time. And Eyal runs the ABA training program here at the University in the School of Education. And we were talking, and at some point he noticed this manual on my desk, and he said, "I just heard about this, I'm so excited about this. I would love to do something with this." And that was really the beginning of this project. I want to take a step back and talk about evidence-based intervention in autism for a moment. So the evidence tells us that in terms of intervention for individuals with autism, there's no one way. We know that we can work in a child-directed fashion, one therapist, one interventionist, and one child in the room, and there are all different approaches for us to do that, and that can certainly be effective. We know that educational interventions in schools, classrooms, can certainly be effective, and we know that peer-mediated interventions can be effective as well. We can pull out typically developing peers from a child with autism's class, give them tools, skills, a framework. They can go back into the classroom and implement the intervention, and that too can be effective. Today we're going to talk about parent-mediated intervention. It's using parents as a way for us to access their children. There is a tremendous amount of evidence at this point that parent-mediated intervention in autism is effective. It's effective at targeting the core symptoms of autism, so the social communication and interaction and the restricted and repetitive behaviors, although I will say there's far less work on the second group of symptoms in terms of intervention in general, and definitely in parent-mediated intervention. One of the nice things about it is that it's time limited, so parents don't feel like this is a never-ending process. We say we're going to start here, we're going to end here. We're giving you a very specific set of skills that you're going to be able to take with you. The experience tends to empower parents. It makes them feel like they're leaving with ability that they didn't have prior to the intervention, and we can deliver it basically anywhere. As long as we're able to access those parents in some type of live communication, we can do it. So we can do it in their home, we can do it at the university, we can do it in medical centers. There are papers published on internet-based interventions, even using this specific protocol actually, so we can work via Skype, Google video. As long as I can work live with a parent, I can deliver a parent-mediated intervention, which makes it very, very attractive. I want to take a moment to clarify sort of the nomenclature of parent training or parent-mediated interventions in autism, because there's some confusion. So parent training in autism divides into two broad categories. One is parent support. Parent support is when the identified patient or the individual that I'm focusing on is not the child, it's the parent. I'm working with the parent, and the parent is my target, and I'm providing them with knowledge that they did not have prior to this program. On the other side, you see parent-mediated intervention. And in parent-mediated intervention, I'm working with the parent, but they are actually not my target. The child is still the direct beneficiary, and I'm working with the parent only as a way for me to access the child. There are evidence-based parent-mediated interventions, as I mentioned, that target the core symptoms of autism, and also that target secondary symptoms such as maladaptive or disruptive behavior, which is the topic of what we're talking about now. So just to clarify what I mean when I say core and secondary symptoms or challenges in autism. We know that in the DSM we have two symptom groups in autism, the first being deficits in social communication and interaction, and the second being the presence of these restrictive and repetitive behaviors, stereotyped interests, etc. But there are all sorts of difficulties that we encounter in exceedingly high percentages of individuals diagnosed with autism that are not diagnostic markers. So I don't have to show that this difficulty is present in an individual in order to diagnose them, but these are difficulties that we encounter very, very frequently. So they're secondary, you can argue that they're tertiary challenges also. We have to think about what's causing what, but these are things that we experience a lot, and these are challenges that parents also have to deal with a tremendous amount of time. And in interventions that are targeting the core symptoms, these are often not included. So we're not providing parents with skills to target these difficulties. Different numbers according to different papers, but one could easily say, one could confidently say that up to 50% of children with autism display concurrent disruptive behaviors at a clinical level. Not a tantrum every once in a while, but really a very, very hard time in the behavioral arena. These disruptive behaviors don't exist in an isolated fashion. So a child with elevated disruptive behaviors is going to experience increased isolation on the playground, in school, at recess. It's going to be harder for us to educate that child, certainly in an inclusive environment and even in a non-inclusive environment. There are more educational challenges. Children with increased disruptive behavior generate parents with increased levels of stress, reduced family quality of life. Increased levels of disruptive behavior also correlate with lower levels of adaptive functioning. So these disruptive behaviors are worth targeting not only in their own right, but because if we're able to reduce these disruptive behaviors, we have the potential to improve functioning in a whole array of other areas. In fact, there's some work that shows that in young children, the greatest source of parental distress is autism symptom severity. So parents of a young child with autism are more stressed the more severe their autism symptoms are. But as children get older, that shifts to actually be co-occurring disruptive behavior. And so high levels of disruptive behavior in older children are associated with higher levels of parental distress, more than autism symptom severity, more than intellectual disability, more than poor adaptive behavior. Enter the Ruby Autism Network. The Ruby Autism Network is a terrible acronym for Research Units in Behavioral Intervention, which is a network of 5 university-based medical centers around the United States that's done a number of different projects on intervention, both pharmacological and obviously behavioral. And this publication is a product of this network of sites. So the first author is Karen Beers, who we mentioned earlier, who's currently at Seattle Children's. So this is currently an evidence-based parent training protocol for disruptive behaviors. I'm not going to go into detail in terms of the content. We can talk about it more afterwards if you'd like. But the idea behind this protocol is in a very structured, uniform way to provide parents with the ability to understand their child's disruptive behaviors and to modify those behaviors. It's geared specifically for children between 3 and 6 or 4 and 8 years old, but there's definitely been some flexibility in terms of where it's been implemented. So we took this manual as soon as Ayala and I sort of connected with each other, and it became very clear that this was a very logical, rational collaboration. And we began to ask how we can use this to ask innovative research questions, and at the same time reach as many people as possible in providing a clinical service that doesn't currently exist in Israel. So we translated the manuals into Hebrew. We translated it into Arabic-ish. It's being corrected, or that translation is being completed currently. And so we are currently running a parent-mediated community implemented group intervention focused on young children with autism and disruptive behaviors. So like I said, we're running these groups in the community, and we're running them in a way where there's one therapist who is either a graduate student of mine or a student in the ABA training program, working with Ayal, working with 4 families. Initially, we actually said 4 parents, so it had to be 1 parent from each family. We got some pushback from families who said that, but we both want to participate. And so, displaying remarkable flexibility, we said, okay. And so it's really 4 families in the end. And this is a 12-week protocol. Like I said, the therapists are advanced students either in the ABA training program here in special education or in clinical child and school psychology. In order to participate in this project, you have to have prior experience either with applied behavior analysis or working with children with autism, and then we work to provide training in the area in which they don't have that experience. And throughout the intervention, they receive weekly supervision from Ayal, who is a board certified behavior analyst. Okay. So in this study, we set about to ask a number of different questions. First, is this possible? So the research that's been published on this protocol, at least until now, has all been university-based or lab-based. So families come to a clinic, to a university, participate in the program. So we want to go out into the community. So are we going to be able to maintain some degree of reliability and provide this intervention in the community in the same form in which it's intended to be provided? Will it be efficacious? So will we be able to achieve our goals in working with these families in the community? And we're also very interested in secondary effects. While this protocol specifically targets disruptive behavior, there are many questions about other effects which it might have. So will it also reduce parent stress? And tying together this project and the previous project which we talked about, we're also measuring family accommodation in these parents pre and post. We also have follow-up data, which I'm not going to present any of today, but we want to know if by providing parents with tools to understand their child's behaviors, are we also changing the way in which they interact with the core symptoms of autism, even though that's not something that we're talking about. And we're also very interested in outcome predictors. Most of this, we still don't know. So these are very preliminary findings. So far, these are the measures that we are collecting. So as in the family accommodation study, actually a significant limitation here is that almost everything is parent report. We don't see the child except for one home visit prior to the start of the intervention, and that's because of the nature of doing this in the community. It's not feasible for us to bring the children in and to do a full diagnostic evaluation. So the children who participate in the study all have confirmed diagnoses according to the Ministry of Education or Bituach Leumi, and we are giving them the social responsiveness scale so that we can have some measure of their autism symptomatology, but there's certainly a lot of data on the kids themselves that we don't have because we are working in the community. We're using the aberrant behavior checklist to look at disruptive behavior itself, and we're giving out this checklist to both parents and to teachers. Teachers obviously are not participating in the intervention, but we're very interested to know whether or not the effects that we see as a result of the intervention are generalizing outside just of the home and outside of the parent-child interaction.
תוכנית שקורית כרגע או זו תוכנית שאתם מתכננים?
קורה.
זה קורה עכשיו?
כן, כן. אני אציג עכשיו נתונים ראשוניים.
אוקיי.
שנה שנייה.
Small comment. I saw a very nice talk on SRCD. It was with normally developing children, typically developing children, and they didn't do any home visits. They just had Skype alone. And they asked, I don't know if it's possible with autistic children to set everything so that it's in the, and you can just have, like 20 minutes, or I don't know if it's that, maybe that's too much. And you can do that a couple of times.
Have eyes on the child.
Yeah, well, think about it. I don't know if it's possible technically, but
So we are
people
actually,
have been doing it.
as part of a collaboration that is at its very, very early stage with Shir Atzil, we are video recording a parent-child interaction before and after. So we see the child. I will say openly that good autism research should have a full diagnostic evaluation of the child. An ADAS, an ADI, a Vineland, all of these things should happen before. And we're not doing that. I still think this is good autism research, but it's something that's important to keep in mind. We don't know as much about the children as ideally we would like to.
But the idea of actually not even doing a video of a dyadic interaction, but actually seeing them at home is something that is becoming much more prevalent, and there was a whole session of it in Imply that I went to as the last session on Saturday, but there was a whole session of it then, and they're exactly using that technique, and it's a wonderful technique, and it actually is more helpful than even a directed play as you usually play is a different thing than let's just watch your התנהלות כללית במהלך היום, and there's something very nice about that. So it is being done, and it's not a bad idea.
I would never think it was a bad idea.
The whole functional assessment of the child's behavior is basically based on the parent report.
Yes.
Correct.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we also have the. Sorry.
I want to say part of the assessment, as far as the behaviors, is also part of the protocol itself. The assessment, as far as the assessment, not regarding the ASD, but regarding the behaviors, part of the assessment is the first sessions of the protocol.
But it's still parent report.
But it's still parent report.
You're not observing the child.
We are not observing the child.
But the parents are.
Yeah, and that's a price that we're sort of willing to pay in order to reach more families who otherwise would not be getting this, and we wouldn't have access to them. That's the only thing we have that's teacher report is the measure of disruptive behavior, which we give to the teachers in the beginning also.
When you say disruptive behavior, you're talking about the repetitive and what do you call it?
No, sorry.
You're talking about the
I'm talking about
aggression and the crying.
tantrum,
and the-
aggression, violence, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
סליחה, אני צריכה לצאת, אבל אני רוצה להגיד... כן, תודה. אבל אני רוצה להגיד משהו, למשל במחוז ירושלים, הילדים מגיל 3 עד, לפני כן, עד 7, הכניסה עד כיתה א', הם יודעים שהיום מקבלים את סל הטב"ם. מה שאומר שהם מקבלים הרבה מאוד, ומה שאומר שההורים שלהם צריכים להיות בקשר עם הרבה מאוד אנשי מקצוע. אז כאילו באה עוד איזושהי תוכנית ונכנסת לכל דבר הזה, זה לא כאן. לעומת זאת, ואשר אני דיברתי עם אייל שחשב לצאת לשטח ולעשות את זה, לילדים מכיתה א' אין מספיק, לא הדרכת הורים, לא מעורבות, לא סיוע, וזה חומר למחשבה.
אז אנחנו...
אפשר להכניס את זה גם לתוכניות הדרכת הורים שיש מ-3 עד 6.
אבל זו תוכנית שעומדת בפני עצמה, הסל הטב"ם הזה, יש הדרכת הורים, כן, לא, יש להם הרבה מאוד, זה סל שבנוי בתוך המסגרות שלהם.
הרבה מקומות, אבל זה לא קיים.
אני יכול להגיד.
בירושלים.
במסגרת בתיה אין בכלל רדיו.
אוקיי, אמרתי מחוז ירושלים.
בתיה אפילו לא שמע על זה. היינו צריכים...
אני רוצה רק להגיד משהו אחד ממך לגבי הדרכות הורים. מהניסיון שלי יש הרבה מסגרות והרבה מקומות שנותנים הדרכות להורים שיש להם את הילדים עם אוטיזם שיש להם, אבל הרבה פעמים ההדרכות, ממה שאני רואה, הן לא מסודרות, הן לא מאורגנות, הרבה פעמים זה זרימה, זה תלוי באיש מקצוע שהוא המדריך.
לא, אני נמצאת במרכז המשפחה של אלוט, ששם נתנו להם מקום, כל גני תקשורת בירושלים מקבלים את ההדרכות ההורים שלהם במקום. כל יום מגיע צוות של הגן, צוות של הזה, וההורים מקבלים שם הדרכות.
וגם על זה יש מחקר, ומחקר שמראה בדיוק את מה שבאמת יוצא לזה. מודל אחר, תמי, זה הכל, זה מודל אחר.
כן, אבל זה גם גיל, זאת אומרת, זה תלוי בגיל, כי הגיל הזה עד 7 הוא מוצף, נכון להיום. הבן שלי בן 26, לנו לא היה כלום מזה. לא הדרכת הורים, עד כדי ככה היה לנו 2.9 שעות פארה-רפואי בשבוע, וגם ה-2.9 הזה שניתנו לילד, היינו באים מבקשים מהסרט, תעשה טובה, אל תיתן לילד ובוא תדריך אותנו על חשבון, כי לא היה לנו עם מי לדבר בכלל. היום יש להם בערך 20 שעות של אנשי מקצוע, וההורים האלה צריכים להיות בקשר עם כל הדבר הזה. אז זאת אומרת שכל הילדים, ואני מדבר גם בחוזר ירושלים, כך או אחרת, בין אם זה תוכנית של וריאטי, בין אם זה של גני תקשורת, כל מה שקיים נגיש שלה, יש להם המון תוכניות, זה לא מנותק, יש להם המון. והשאלה, האפקטיביות של זה.
אני רוצה לסיים את
האם לא כדאי באמת...
לא סיימתי קודם, אני רק רוצה להגיד תמי, שאחד מהרעיונות שלי לפחות זה באמת לקחת את ה... כי אני מכיר, יש המון הדרכות והמון אנשי מקצוע, אבל ספציפית שיש ילדים עם ASD, עם ההתנהגויות המאתגרות האלה, אז לתת בעצם איזושהי מודל אחר של התערבות שהיא מובנית, שהיא מסודרת, זאת אומרת לא רק לתרום להורים ולילדים, אבל זה גם מאוד מאוד יכול לתרום לאנשי מקצוע עצמם שמגיעים, שהרבה פעמים שנתקלים במקרים כאלה, אז קצת צריכים לזרום עם המקרה וגישה כזאת, תהליך כזה, ואין איזשהו משהו שהוא מאוד מאוד מסודר ומאורגן.
רק אם אתה תעשה את זה בתוך הבית זה יעזור, וגם אם אתה תיתן את ההדרכה הזאת לאנשי מקצוע שעובדים בבית. כי הצוותים שעובדים במסגרות החינוך מקבלים את ההדרכות שלהם.
המטרה פה זה לתת להורים בעצם את הכלים שהם יוכלו להתמודד עם ההתנהגויות שמופיעות בבית, אם זה בבוקר, בערב, בהתארגנות, בזמנים שאין שם אף אחד אחר לעזור להם.
So that our ultimate goal actually, so first of all, Tommy, I definitely hear your criticism. I think that's fair. No, it's important. I think it's important, obviously, to identify the gaps in services that work there and not provide an additional service to people who are already getting something. I think this specifically is not something that parents have gotten in the past, so I feel like there's value. But we are working with special education schools also, so first and second graders who meet these criteria. And they're bringing us the families. I'll explain a little bit about the recruitment and how we're getting to the families. But I appreciate that comment. Okay. All right. So far, the data that I'm going to be presenting, which again is very preliminary, is not on all these families, but we have 34 families that have either participated or are participating currently in these groups, which is 12 groups. 5 of them have been done in Hebrew. 7 of them have been done in Arabic, which is actually interesting. It's not typically what you see. 88% of the children who are participating are male, or 88% of the families who are participating have children who are male. Groups so far, and y'all tell me if I'm missing somewhere, have taken place in Holon, Kfar Kasem, Ariel, Modi'in, and East and West Jerusalem. Right? Anywhere else? And that's as far as we've gotten so far. The way in which we're working is in a way that is intended to be sustainable. So our ideal is actually to come in to a partner site who recruits the families for us. So they have a clinical population, whether it be a special education school, and you see the Sifas school in Modi'in there, a special education preschool, you see Sanabel, Ganim in East Jerusalem, Basman in East Jerusalem, or a community center, that's Bet Akadem, which is a nonprofit, that's a community center in Modi'in, and they recruit families. So they say to their population, we have this service, somebody will come here and provide this service to you, who needs it and who wants it, and then we send the therapist, the student, to go provide the service in the community. And so we actually are not constricted by sites. As long as there's a site that says we have 4 families that need this, and we have a therapist who can access that site geographically, we're happy to make it happen wherever and whenever. I want to be clear that this type of project definitely takes a village, especially due to the community implemented piece of it. So we're very fortunate to have financial support from the Joseph Levy Foundation in the UK. Ayal obviously coordinates this project. And each individual who's on the screen right now really is essential to the success of this project. So Mishlina, Linoy, and Steele, and Amjad, and Samira, and Bar, and Nidnat, and Ariel, and Mariam, and Raluca are all people who, without what they're doing for this project, it wouldn't be happening. This depends on people who are willing to get trained, get weekly supervision, and take time to go out into the community and provide this intervention. What I want to present today are, again, some very, very preliminary results. So there's a lot of data that we haven't looked at yet, data that's not complete. The data that I'm going to be presenting today is looking at parent and teacher report of the aberrant behavior checklist, so disruptive behaviors as reported by both parent and by teacher. I'm going to present the family accommodation findings and the responses to the parenting stress index, which we gave to the parent who's participating in the intervention, but we also gave it to the parent who's not participating in the intervention, and I'm presenting that because I think there's some interesting findings here.
Just one parent participates.
So we actually open it up to both parents. Typically it's one parent. I mean, typically it's mothers, but also parents of young children with autism and disruptive behavior don't usually have a ton of flexibility to say, sure, let's go out once a week. And if they can go out once a week, it's probably not to us, which is legitimate and fair. Okay. So these findings are statistically significant, but this is a small sample. And obviously, we'll learn more as we get older. But we see on the parent report of the aberrant behavior checklist is that we are seeing a significant reduction in disruptive behavior between the beginning of the intervention and the end of the intervention. I think what's really remarkable is actually the teacher report. So what we see here is that teachers are reporting a crazy improvement in disruptive behaviors, and teachers don't know what's happening. We're not working with them, we're not communicating with them. All we're doing is saying, please fill out this questionnaire. I don't have any explanation other than what you see on the screen, but it's clear that there's some improvement that's happening outside of the parent-child relationship. And
Does the teacher know the parents are participating?
Yes, yeah.
It might affect their...
It might, absolutely. This is extreme, but absolutely there could be that definitely could be playing a role. When we looked at parents' responses to the family accommodation measure, so we saw that as a result, I will not say as a result, but there was a difference between levels of family accommodation before the intervention and after the intervention. Now, in the first part of this talk, I talked about the strong correlation between family accommodation and RRBs. So we measured RRBs as well, and it does look like there's a connection when you look here, but actually the reduction in RRBs was not commensurate with what we would expect to see if the nature of the link between family accommodation and RRBs was as strong as I posited it was a few minutes ago. And so obviously this is sort of highlighting another possible direction for us to sort of better understand really what's going on here. It is nice, regardless, to see that there is a reduction in RRBs on a clinical level in terms of pre and post. So the last finding that I'm going to show you guys is the parents' responses to the parenting stress index. So here you have the participating parent, and statistically significant, you see that parents who participated in this project reported decreased stress after participating in the intervention. The non-participating parents reported increased stress after the intervention. And so this raises a lot of questions. I think, if nothing else, it certainly speaks to the value of working with families and not with individual members of families. And we can hypothesize all sorts of dynamics that might be happening if we're providing one parent with a specific framework or tools that they come home and they start implementing. Another parent is not on board, doesn't agree, doesn't really understand the theoretical background. They don't buy in as much. So one parent's doing one thing and the other parent maybe is not doing it. So we don't understand exactly what's happening here, but certainly is obviously something that we need to look into further, yeah.
Okay, so two really important things. First of all, it's really interesting, but I don't know how many of these were moms and dads, but moms typically have higher levels of stress anyways than fathers do, and notice that if it was mostly moms who were the participating parent, that would be reflected there, and that maybe possibly by the parent by not participating but actually watching and seeing that something can be done, whatever it is that wasn't helping him be stressful before is now facing him in the face that maybe he needs to be doing something too. So there are real ways of looking at that might end up kind of answering your questions, but you should look at the gender, because there's a real gender thing, and there's lots of research on how moms of autistic children have the highest stress, specifically on the PSI.
Yeah.
Did you do the long or the short?
We did the short.
36?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Don't you think it would be interesting to compare these mothers or fathers coming in and just talking to them and not giving them the actual practice program, just talking to them, to see if the talking itself to somebody 12 weeks in a row might reduce your anxiety.
So it's interesting. In the first paper that Karen and her colleagues published, not the first paper actually, but the randomized control trial that they did of this intervention, they compared this protocol to psychoeducation. So one group of parents was getting this, and one group of parents was basically getting something on the other end, right? It's just teaching them about autism. And there were statistically significant differences, so they were able to say that this is great, but not as big as they thought, not because this wasn't working, but because that was much more effective than they thought it would be. So just sitting with parents and saying, when we talk about autism, this is what we mean, was much more effective and helpful than they thought it was going to be.
The previous slide, you said that the reduction of RRBs wasn't as expected. It wasn't,
right.
But it's not the RRBs, it's the disruptive behavior. Hang on.
Correct.
This is not.
This is the RRBs.
This is the repetitive behavior.
Correct.
You explained there'd be a reduction in that.
Well, we asked whether or not there would be a reduction.
But there was a reduction.
But specifically, they were asking it because of the family accommodation scam.
No,
Well,
I know,
actually-
but you want to get a child in my class. My garden keeps going up. She had a severe stimming, turning, and we tried lots of behavioral ways. You can have it here, you can have it here, you can have stress, screaming, crying, biting. You know what? Go on, stim as much as you want. Within a year, the stimming was gone. We did nothing. Let her stim all day long. Because, as you said, it could be a self-regulatory behavior, and by the time I didn't cause the distress of only here, only here, only here, it wasn't an OCD behavior. It was a self. And I'm asking if the stress of the parent, maybe the parents beforehand were in a situation of fighting it and then accommodating. I don't like the behavior, I'm going to fight it, and now I'm going to. Now, okay, it's a behavior that's autistic or self-regulatory. It's an acceptable behavior. I don't have to fight it.
Yeah.
And then the behavior isn't going away, but the stress of the parent. And then probably the disruptive behavior would have gone away.
Yeah. So I think
But
as
even
we-
though there's self-stimulatory behavior or the repetitive behavior is wrong.
So again, these are very small numbers, right? This is, I think most of these were done on 24 families, but as we have more data, we'll be able to look a little bit more about the relationship between the different
Because
variables.
it's interesting to see how the parents responded
Yeah, it's really interesting,
initially before the intervention. Like, did they accommodate straight away, or did they fight it and never accommodate?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's whatever. Disruptive behaviors too.
Okay. Okay.
What time, when do you do this intervention? Like during the day, what time?
So we pair up, once we have families, we assign them a therapist, and they work out when works for them. As long as there's a room open in that school or community center, it's up to the therapist to say to the parents when works for you, and obviously what works for them, and they find the time. It's typically evenings.
Typically evenings, once a week for 12 weeks. And
Yeah.
we set the dates in advance, so we know the dates. And
Yeah, just because part of the reason of the increased stress of the other parent is that he's maybe staying at home with his child.
That's I like that. Stop leaving me. Right. Yeah. Very good. Okay. So this was the parenting stress findings. So just to sum up these, again, very preliminary results, we found that, at least in this very small sample, working with parents, we can reduce the disruptive behavior as reported by the parent, and even more significantly as reported by the teacher. Parents seem to be accommodating less. What impact that reduction in accommodation has is sort of unclear. Parenting stress of the participating parent is down, but it's very possible that inadvertently we're actually raising stress in the family system as a whole. So that obviously needs our attention, immediately. In terms of next steps in this project, so we've begun, because one of the vulnerabilities now is we don't have a control group, we're not comparing it to anything. So we're beginning a control group of individuals. Our goal is to, again, do this in a way where we leave it in the community. So we're meeting with Khalid next week and other community partners. The idea is for us to come into a site, bring our therapist, but have somebody from there participate as well, so that when this study is over, we can leave and the intervention in this project remains in place, independent of the study. And obviously there are thoughts about, okay, we need to be accessing a broader population with perhaps a broader protocol. This protocol is specific to disruptive behaviors for many parents who are in need of support that aren't necessarily going to benefit as much from this specific protocol. But that's, I would say, down the line. So just summing up sort of both parts of this, so family accommodation seems worthy of our attention, and we can work with parents to provide key skills and capacities for their children. So I just want to thank, it's an old lab picture, those are my students, except the cute one in the back. That's Roni. Again, the Joseph Levy Foundation, Karen, Ellie, and all others who participated along the way. I'm happy if there are questions or thoughts left over. I'm more than happy to take them.
Questions, more questions, comments? And to Claudia, who is our wonderful representative of the Joseph Levy Foundation, and really never do this without you, so thank you.
I just wanted to add about the last thing you said with the partner sites. I think something unique with what we're doing is actually training people in the partner sites. So once really that we can back out and they can stay with the protocol, with our training, and continue to give
And
this.
are you going to test feasibility and efficacy on that as well?
Once
Will you
we.
go back, once you leave, and check those people and see what they're doing? No, but I think if you're actually saying that part of what you're doing is feasibility and efficacy, then you put in sustainability by doing that, you have to check feasibility and efficacy for that as well. And then you've really done it.
היי, אני מתנצלת על האיחור בהתחלה והצלחתי להתחבר. אני לא יודעת אם זה מתאים כי אני לא מכירה את הפרוטוקול, אבל הייתי מציעה במחקרי המשך סביב הקונטרול, גרופ שהעלית לעשות את זה, אולי כן, אני חושבת שבפרוטוקול יש גם יחידה של knowledge, נכון? או לא? בפרוטוקול עצמו של ה-intervention group. אוקיי, אז...
אין שום דבר שקשור לאוטיזם.
הבנתי, כי אז יכול להיות שזה לא מתאים, אבל מה שאני אומרת שיכול להיות מעניין להשוות דווקא לקונטרול גרופ שכן תהיה קבוצה שתקבל משהו אחר, למשל הרצאה שיש בה knowledge ולא את כל תוכנית ההתערבות, כי זה יכול לתת השוואה אחרת לעומת השוואה לקבוצת ביקורת של פרטים. כי יש משהו בקונספט של קבוצה שהוא יותר שוויוני, אז אם כבר חולמים על המשך, אז הייתי חושבת גם על האופציה הזאת כקונטרול גרופ, כי אז יש יותר matching.
So that really, first of all, that is a possibility. And that, again, in the first randomized control trial that they did, that was what they did. They compared it to psychoeducation, which is actually a program that we can access and they're happy to share with us. So your resources are limited, and the parents that we're encountering are parents who are very much in need of this support. So we've toyed with different ideas, right? A waitlist control, but it's very hard when there are families who are saying, but I need help, right? So saying, you hang out for a couple of months while we do this, and then we'll get to you soon. It's ethically challenging, but I think that is a good suggestion. Okay.
Thank you.